Hello, I am the nihilist. You are not the nihilist, but you can still call me the nihilist. And welcome to this podcast. It was originally going to be the last podcast, the last episode in my Liner Notes podcast series, which I started last year, 2023. But things went a bit, shall we say, pear-shaped towards the end of last year on a social level for us here in the Greater Manchester queer community. The only guest that I ever had invited onto the Liner Notes podcast, and it went amazingly well, and I wanted to do a lot more work with her in the future, moving on, maybe particularly with that podcast series. That person passed away, unfortunately, in September of last year. And I am, of course, talking about the wonderful, incredible, incomparable, and I'm very, very proud to say that she is and was my queer daughter, the amazing Fi Barret. Fi's loss has been a massive blow to not just the Greater Manchester queer community at large, but also the more kind of smaller, tighter-knit family communities that exist here in Manchester and in Salford and around a couple of spots like Islington Mill and, for instance, and perhaps like the White Hotel and certain venues like that and DBA maybe hidden. Fi's loss has been a massive blow, and I'm pretty sure that anyone who's listening to this podcast will know who Fi Barret is. But if you don't, if somehow you stumble across this podcast at some point in the future, maybe, and you don't know who this person is, then you can go back into my own archive of podcasts, look for Liner Notes. I think it was episode number 5, and it was an episode where I got Fi to quote-unquote hijack the podcast, where she basically hosted it and then she interviewed me. And I'd had such amazing, incredible chats with Fi throughout her entire life that I knew her. It just seemed obvious to me that she would be an amazing podcast host. And she was so clever, so sharp, so witty, so funny, so warm, so queer, so all those things. And yeah, in my head I was like, oh, I know, I'm going to ask Fi to come onto Liner Notes, and we'll kind of break the ice in terms of working together on a podcast, because we talked about working on a podcast together many times over the few years previously. Unfortunately, that never came to fruition in terms of a specific podcast that me and Fi would work on and produce together. But thankfully, that episode of Liner Notes still exists, and I have at least captured Fi briefly, temporarily, in that form. And truthfully, I haven't been able to listen back to that episode since she died. It's pretty fucking heavy, if I'm honest with you. But I think that anybody who's listening to this now and who has lost someone they love, someone who's close to them and someone they love, particularly if you're a parental figure in that person's life, as I turned out to be. That wasn't the plan, but she told me that I was the closest thing she had to a gay dad, so I was like, fucking hell, I'll take that. And I was very, very proud to call her my queer daughter as well. You know what it's like if you've lost someone. So we're September, October, November, December. We're 4.5 months after losing Fi at this point, and I'm not new to grief. It's not a new thing for me. I've lost various different people over the course of my life, some of whom I'm going to be talking about on this podcast. So I kind of know how it goes, even though there's no real roadmap for grief. But there is kind of like, you can feel the stages. And once you've lost a few people, you can feel yourself going through those stages. So while the death of Fi Barret isn't raw to me anymore, it's still bringing up so much stuff. And yeah, that's my roundabout way of explaining to you, the listeners, why you're not listening to liner notes anymore. I am going to be covering in this, I think this might be a 3-part premiere to kick off this new podcast series, may I add. You're not listening to liner notes anymore. I want to welcome you officially to my brand new podcast. Welcome to NIALLISM. Hello listeners, welcome to NIALLISM. Now, if you've arrived at this podcast from some far-flung unknown point in the future, you may have a question, and to be honest with you, I ask myself the same thing all the time. To quote Beanie Man, who am I? Well, that was part of the process of what I was trying to document in Liner Notes, the previous podcast series that I mentioned, that I've decided now to give a soft reboot to, akin to a ballerina pump to the balls. So, being a bit of a lazy bastard, I am going to just use the things that I had prepared for the last few episodes of Liner Notes that were to tie up the series and to document the year that I went to in 2023 for this triptych of series premieres that I've got in mind for NIALLISM. So I am going to be talking about the music that I've been putting up on Spotify and all the major streaming platforms through DistroKid. I'm also going to be talking about Album of the Month Club, which was the project that I launched last year, which the Liner Notes series was the tie-in with. Album of the Month Club was me, the nihilist, uploading to all the major streams through DistroKid platform, a different release by myself every month. They were mostly mostly EPs with a few albums in there as well, and then there were some singles that I come together in one month, but then there were some singles that had like 6 or 7 tracks on them, and I'm like, babe, that's an EP, that's not really a single. A single to me is like 1 or 2 or maybe 3 tunes. Anything more than 3 tunes, that's an EP. 6 tunes is a mini album. That's actually my favourite format of all time. Thank you, Velvet Underground, for White Light, White Heat, transforming my life in that way. And a bunch of other albums that I probably can't think of that have all got 6 tracks and I love immensely. But to go back to the Beanie Man question, who am I? Well, one thing that should be quite obvious, I think anyway, listening to my voice, I'm Irish. I would self-describe myself as an artist. I work in a variety of different media, but the one that I've kind of dedicated most of my life to, and the one that I keep falling back into and being dragged back into, even not by my own choice, but seemingly it's something cosmic, is music. I write music, I produce music, and I also DJ. And that's kind of, I think, where people know me the most from in Manchester, possibly in Glasgow, and from around the UK and Ireland, is being a DJ and playing out in clubs. Just for the record, and to insert a little bit of show-offery, the clubs that I have been involved in my life over here in the UK, where do we start? So probably the best known one that I was involved in Glasgow was Menergy, which was run by the drag queen Guillotina Munter. And then when I moved to Manchester, not long after doing Menergy in Glasgow, I started up with my partner an event called Tranarchy here in Manchester, and that really blew the doors wide open for a lot of the current queer and drag scenes that exist in the city now. After Tranarchy ended, my partner Joe and I took a bit of a hiatus and then came back with an event called Body Horror, which officially was the first queer night to happen at the venue, the White Hotel, in 2017. Since then, that venue has gone on to become one of the most kind of like important and happening venues in Greater Manchester. I say Greater Manchester because it's in Salford, it's not actually in Manchester. But we were the people who did the first queer event there and opened the doors to a lot of other nights that are actually mostly straight, then turning around and going, we want to be queer too. Good on yous. but we were there first. But the most important club, the one that I've been involved in, and the one that, like, you know, if you're a disco nerd, you know the story about Larry Levan and his relationship to the Paradise Garage and how he was a king in his own little court there. I feel the most important club that I've ever been involved in, probably ever, even moving forward with stuff that, you know, will come up in the future, we don't know, but I'm just going to say it now. The most important club that I've ever been involved with, and the club that has done more than any other, literally any other, regardless of anything that happens at these cooler venues, the most important club night that has ever existed on Manchester's queer scene, and that still exists and holds a massive influence over the queer scene and the LGBTQIA plus community in Greater Manchester right now, is none other than Bollocks. It just is. It was there from day one. It opened the doors to a mix of people, including gay, straight, pan, bi, and also all kinds of gender variants. Body size, body positivity has always been a massive, massive part of Bollocks as a club. And you, as a fat person, I have to tell you, it's really hard to be as body positive in some of these other cooler spaces. Bollocks was the OG. And I'm so proud to have been involved in that club. It's currently on a hiatus. I don't know what's going to happen with it, but to be honest with you, I feel like it's not my baby. I'm just very, very thankful to Rod Connolly, who runs that club, for asking me to be involved. And over the last post-lockdown, since I started DJing officially at Bollocks, which was in 21, 22 and 23, some of the absolute slam dunk best sets of my life. And it really is the place where you see the real queer community coming together to celebrate each other. And my proudest thing as a DJ, so far anyway, but I reckon I'm just so made up, that Rod Connolly asked me to become a resident DJ at Bollocks when it moved into a new phase of its life at the Deaf Institute, at which point it was able to open till 6 a.m, and I was granted the 4 a.m. till 6 a.m. slot. And I can tell you now, it was the best clubbing experience of my life, not just for me as a DJ, but for the crowd and the performers and the dancers who were there. And I'd just like to toot my own trumpet also at this point and say, I've been involved in ballroom and Vogue culture for over a decade now. And Bollocks Dance Floor from 4 a.m. till 6 a.m. when I was doing it was the only reliable space in Manchester that you could come and hear ballroom, beats, tribal house and diva house that was made by and for queers and the gay/trans community. There are other things that pop up and play a little bit of ballroom. They like to sprinkle ballroom into the mix, and I love going out and I love seeing the girls. Hey girls, you know who you are, you know who I am. I love seeing you out in the club, chucking the fans about, arms, bit of whacking, doing it. But the Nihilist sets at Bollocks from 4 a.m. till 6 a.m. are literally the only place these girls can go to and actually throw down against each other. They can do a runway, they can do a catwalk. If they're feeling brave, members of the crowd can join in. But that is real queer community. And I realise that there are probably some people listening to this podcast who will question that, but I don't. I am speaking from a place of authority on that because I realise now, looking back over my life, it's what I've been doing for most of my life. In Glasgow and in Manchester as well, and to a certain extent in London, where about a decade ago I was lucky enough to be able to help the London ballroom community come together. I'm not going to talk too much on this particular podcast about ballroom, Vogue culture and my involvement in it. I'm going to keep that for a separate podcast because there's a lot to go into there as well, and it's not relevant to right now. But don't worry, I will come back and cover that in great detail at some point on a future podcast. But I know what I'm talking about. I know what this stuff is, so I don't mind now having to occupy a position of authority on that, because it's, like I said, it's what I've always done and what we're still doing here in Manchester, particularly around, well, I say Manchester, it should technically be Salford, because now the community that we're helping to develop exists at Islington Mill, which is an amazing place. And if you don't know what Islington Mill is, I will direct you back to my previous podcast series, Islington Mill is Queer, and Islington Mill which goes out every month still, and is a good place to go to find out about Islington Mill if you don't know what that is. I've also covered my life and work in Glasgow on the previous Liner Notes podcast in quite some detail, so I don't want to go into that much here. You can go back into my archive and find those episodes and learn that stuff in greater detail yourself. The only thing I'd say is that I was part of a few different communities in Glasgow in my time there, and if you've listened to Liner Notes, you probably heard me talk about the Chateau, which was an artist studio space, community, collective kind of vibe deal thing that was happening in Glasgow 2002 to about 2007. It was originally a space founded by the band Franz Ferdinand for them to record and practice and hone their skills before they set off to London and became an international pop sensation that they did. But they also got a lot of their friends from the Glasgow School of Art to move in, and I wasn't one of them, but my friend was, so I got in there. And you can find out about what we did at the Chateau and stuff like that in Liner Notes, as I've mentioned. But just to say that in the summer of 2007, my life went through some massive upheavals. One of them was also the closure of the Chateau. The building itself was very decrepit, and by 2007, about 5 years into the collective project, it became a bit too dodgy to work in. And unfortunately, at some point towards the end of the summer of 2007, there was an arson attack on the Chateau building. Somebody, or some bodies I should say, broke into the building and set fire on the 3rd floor, which thankfully didn't take completely, but it took enough to be noticed from the street, and the fire brigade were called. I was the last person to leave the building on the night of the arson attack. And I was literally on the bus home. I'd left the building, I'd left our studio at about 11:15 to get the last bus to my home in the West End at the time, and I was on the bus when I received a phone call from Camille Lorigo, who was the proprietor of Chez Camille, which was big fashion boutique, kind of bespoke tailoring service boutique on the 3rd floor that was directly beneath our studio. And Camille called me on the phone as I was on the bus, just about to get off at the stop where my house was, to tell me that the Chateau was on fire. That was obviously a very distressing phone call to take. We had originally, myself and my then flatmate at the time, Kepa Rasmussen, had moved into the Chateau in 2003, and we had rented out what was basically a glorified corridor space within the building. But I'm looking around my flat now from which I'm recording this podcast, and I think it was about the same size as the main room in my flat, so it was really big, and we were paying literally £20 a month between the two of us to rent that space. In about 2005, I think it was, another group of artists who had another space within the building moved out. They were friends of ours, so we moved into their space, and the space that we had multiplied by about 1.5 times the size, and the rent went up. It went wildly up to the price of £60 a month between me, Kepa, and my best friend Matt, who was living in Sweden for a while but moved back to Glasgow and dedicated so much of his time to building a studio with us in that space. We worked on a load of different music projects in the studio over those few years that we had it, the most notable of which was probably the act Evil Eye, which was a kind of Italo Giallo horror movie soundtrack, John Carpenter-esque synth soundtrack kind of band that I worked on primarily with the guitarist and multi-instrumentalist Jeff Crowther, and we also had a few rolling different live acts that appeared under a few different names. Shout outs to Brad Manners and to Dalai Damer, who were also involved in a lot of music that was created there, and to everyone who played live with us when we played live under the name They Live, which is a name that I would like to bring back because it's an awesome name, I think. But yeah, receiving a phone call saying that the chateau was on fire was pretty devastating. Thankfully, though, our studio was relatively unscathed, even though the fire had been set on the floor below us, directly below us. Thankfully, like I said earlier, the fire didn't take. So when the fire brigade came, they were able to put it out quite quickly, and that was how it was discovered that it was set on purpose, that it was an arson attack, because some of the remnants of what was set up to set the place on fire were still left. They hadn't actually taken fire. Unfortunately, though, pretty much everything that was on the third floor Chez Camille boutique space was pretty much destroyed, or was so damaged by the smoke, if not the fire itself, that it became unusable. So the people who were involved in that space made the decision to move out of there, which is completely understandable. A lot of us hung on in the chateau after that happened to try and keep making it work, but really the writing was on the wall, and there was, it wasn't a safe space anymore, and we just had to accept that. And I had nowhere else to put all the music equipment that we had collected over the years. So unfortunately, my dream of having a studio I thought at the time that it had died. It definitely went to bed. All the synths that I've been collecting either went to storage, or I gave them to friends, or whatever. A lot of the music equipment, yeah, I've held on to bits and pieces of that stuff over the years, but, that was the end of the era of the chateau, and my first attempt at starting a music studio in a shared collective artist community space. However, as you may have gathered from what I was saying earlier on in this podcast, life has taken a very funny circular turn for me, and I have again been granted studio space within another collective artist-based community, which is, of course, Islington Mill, as I had previously mentioned. It's very weird, but very fulfilling, but also... Let me pause this while I think of how to articulate what I need to say exactly. Look, it's just very weird on a cosmic level to be given a second crack of the whip at doing this thing. And this time round, I am taking it very bloody seriously. Not just for the gratification of my own ego and for my desire to make my own music and get my own sounds and ideas and thoughts and all that stuff out there, but also to help other artists on the come up to achieve their goals as well. As I mentioned at the start, and well, near the start, not the exact start, but when I was talking about who I am, the Beanie Man question, as I mentioned, I'm Irish, and something that I kind of have come to believe more and more strongly, and as I get older, is the luck of the Irish, because I am really fucking lucky, I'm not going to deny that. To be given, again, the chance to do another music studio with the same principles and the same practices of what we were trying to do the first time around in Glasgow, to almost 20 years later. In fact, oh God, it is 20 years later. Oh my God. Sorry, I just have to process that for a second. Yeah, it is. It's 20 years later, and I'm being given, as I said, a second crack of the whip. And oh my God, you guys, I feel so lucky to be able to go back and revisit that thing that happened and to try and do it again and to do it better and to make it right. So I am very invested in this studio, but also the community that is there around this, around like the people who come into the studio as well. We're all part of this community that is budding and growing and hopefully thriving at Islington Mill. And this is just to let you know why I feel so invested in ideas of community, not just because I am dedicated through my life work of trying to create safe spaces for queers to fully live their authentic realities as themselves without judgment. This is something I've needed and I've benefited from it massively. So of course I'm going to try and recreate it for the other people in my community who need that as well. And to bring it back to the little monologue I gave at the start of this podcast, Fi Barret was somebody who did benefit from coming to the studio and coming to these spaces that we create throughout her entire life journey as a queer person coming out and expressing her transness openly and with no shame and no regret. She expressed it to us on many occasions that Tranarchy was the first place where she was seen and validated as a trans woman, and she always always kept that energy with her, and it was why we are so proud to have her as our daughter. And I'm trying to do these community things for people like Fi. So this is just my way of explaining why I might come across as a bit salty about this stuff, but it's coming from a place of pure passion, because I have been around and I have seen this stuff work, and I'm still here doing it, and I want it to be for all the young and old and anybody who needs it, but all the queers who need these spaces. We're here to build them, and we want these spaces to exist and to be safe places for all queers to express themselves as best that they can. There's a little bit more to the Glasgow story left, including the free digital download label that I set up called Little Rock Records, and the highlight of my life was getting to do a gig at Optimo, the legendary Glasgow club, where I did 2 live gigs for them, and I'm just always grateful for Keith and Johnny for seeing me and for believing enough in me to give me those slots. But I'll talk about that in more detail in a coming episode of NIALLISM. I just want to say as well that Fi's involvement in the podcast last year was super important to me for validating me as an actual artist, and not just somebody who works in the community and does, stuff to all the stuff that I've been talking about, but actually me as an artist and me as a musician. When I came to Manchester, my kind of vision changed a bit. And music became less important to me as I started to follow other passions and had to do other things to make ends meet. But I'm very much getting back on the horse now, and Fi, thank you so much for your belief in me as an artist and somebody you thought was cool enough to want to hear more of and to be very interested in my personal story. We will never ever forget you. You're going to always be a legend within our queer families and our community here. And if anybody who's listening to this wants to hear any more, as I said earlier on in this podcast, please go back to episode 5 of Liner Notes, the previous podcast series that I put out last year, where I spoke with Fi, where she interviewed me in the Fi Barret hostile takeover of the Liner Notes podcast. I've been doing a lot of podcasting in the last couple of years. I really enjoy it as a medium, and I think there's something about Irish people being very good at podcasting. I'm just going to throw that out there right now. But at this point, I'd also like to give a massive shout out to Darren Knight at the George House Trust, who I was recently awarded a grant by the LGBT Foundation, a grant of £1,000 that I've spent on a whole new suite of microphones to be able to better create podcasts moving forward in the future, including the Islington Mill and podcast, this podcast, NIALLISM, and some potential future podcasts that are currently brewing up at the moment. So big shout out to everyone at the LGBT Foundation and George House Trust, in particular Darren Knight, currently listening to this on one of the microphones that I was able to acquire through the grant. It's picking up a very lovely room-based atmosphere sound in the background of my voice. I'm not actually recording this in a deadened room, I'm recording it in the front room of our flat, just to pick up a bit of live ambience. When I move around as well, I think you're hearing the squeak of my chair, which is again adding to the audio nuance. But I've been speaking for quite a while now, and I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all so much for listening to this podcast. This has been episode 1 of NIALLISM, me, the Nihilist's new podcast. I am the Nihilist, and you can call me the Nihilist. Like I mentioned previously, I feel very lucky, and when I look back over some of the things that I have managed to achieve over my music career over the last 20 odd years, some stuff is just like, oh boy, you lucky bastard, how did you get that? And this is one of those moments. I'm going to play out episode 1 with the Egyptian Lover remix of my cover version of Missy Elliott's Work It. If you don't know who Egyptian Lover is, he is an absolute godfather of electro music who came out of LA in the early 80s, and he's still going strong. He is the absolute king of the 808. There is no denying that. And he so gladly said that he would remix my cover version of another one of my heroes, Missy Elliott's banger, Work It. I think we all know this tune, right? Everybody knows Work It. At least if you don't, you really need to get on it. Or if you don't, stay tuned, because I'm just about to cover it right now and you're going to hear it. This is the end of episode 1 of NIALLISM. I'll be back with episode 2 and episode 3 in this triptych fairly soon. And all I've got left to say is thank you again for listening, and I hope you tune in for episodes 2 and 3 coming your way soon. This is The Nihilist, Work It, as remixed by Egyptian Lover. Goodbye for now.
This is for my peoples, all my peoples. Work it.
I'd like to get to know you so I can show you. Put the pussy on you like I told you. Get me on your number so I can phone you. And if your girl's expecting, call me over. Not in the bed, let me on the sofa. Go for your gun, nigga, she what you try. You do what you don't, you will, I won't try. Go downtown, nigga, like a vulture. Some of my lips and my hips don't try. See my ass and my tits don't try. I'll list a few pounds and my whips for y'all. It's the kind of pick up those drugs, sex music, I say blah blah blah. Work it, I need a glass of water. Boy, oh boy, it's good to know God. Is it worth it? Let me work it. I let my find out, flip it and reverse it. If you got a big gun, let me search it. Find out how hard I gotta work it. If you a fly girl, get your nails done. Get a pedicure, get your hair beat. Boy, raise it up, let's make it toaster. Let's get drinks going to the closer. Don't look like a jack black poster. See the other dress straight tracks on ya. Your girlfriend wanna be like me, never. You won't find a bitch that's even better. I'll make you hot as Las Vegas weather. Listen up close as I take it backwards.
Outstanding, I ain't buff.
I'm not a prostitute, but I can give you what you want. Love your grips and your mouth full of phones. Love the way my ass goes, ka-bum-bum-bum. Keep your eyes on like a tuk-a-tum-tum. Think you can handle this, ka-bum-bum-bum. With my thumb off, all the S goes boom. Flip the lights on and you see what I can do. Is it worth it? Let me work it. I let my thing go.